My name is Aisha Marable, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. Nigeria Bailey, producer of tonight's event, and I welcome you on behalf of ADP, our funder, John Schreiber, our president and CEO, and the entire New Jersey Performing Arts Center family. You know, during the COVID pandemic, we have enjoyed bringing you programming in your living room, but we look forward to seeing you back at NJPAC really soon. We are delighted that you have joined us tonight and our community partner, Tim Chris, and the Newark History Society for an interesting and engaging virtual program, The Debate Over Alcohol, Temperance and Prohibition in Newark. As Newark once was the home of many breweries, and by 1900, there were more than 1,200 bars, almost one on every corner. Debates over alcohol played out for decades in Newark's pulpits, courtrooms, and newspapers, culminating in Prohibition and the 18th Amendment. We are in for a treat tonight. So sit back and enjoy the very special conversation. I want to give a special thanks in advance to our dynamic panel that Tim will introduce. And we welcome you to engage in conversation with them by using your chat feature, raising your hand, and engaging in a dynamic dialogue yourself in that chat. Let's enjoy tonight's presentation.
Well, thanks, Aisha. I want to add my welcome on behalf of the Newark History Society. And this is the 93rd public program that the Newark History Society has sponsored since our founding some 19 years ago. And we're especially pleased that NJPAC is co-sponsoring and hosting this one. So thank you, Aisha, and all your colleagues at NJPAC for all that you do to engage the Newark community. And I just want to make sure that we're all showing up on the screen here. There we are, okay. So tonight's program, the debate over alcohol, temperance and prohibition in Newark, 1880 to 1930, focuses on a topic that roiled Newark for decades. And we're fortunate to have three presenters, all of whom are members of our executive committee at the Newark History Society. And they will each make a brief presentation and then engage in a panel discussion as we take your questions. So as Aisha said, please add your questions to Zoom's Q&A function as we go along. Michele Rotunda is going to go first. Michele earned her PhD at Rutgers, New Brunswick, and she's an assistant professor of history at Union County College. And her book, A Drunkard's Defense, Alcohol, Murder, and Medical Jurisprudence in 19th Century America, was just published last February by University of Massachusetts Press. And she's going to draw on some of the research that she did for that book that focuses on an incident in Newark. George Robb will go next and discuss the temperance movement in Newark. George, as many of you know, is a professor of history at William Patterson University, and he's currently working on a book about World War I and Newark. And George will be followed by Laura Troiano, who will describe the problems that Newark police had in enforcing prohibition. Laura earned her PhD in American Studies from Rutgers Newark, where she teaches the History of Newark course, and she's now the acting director of the Honors College at Rutgers Newark. So Michele, let's get started with you.
Okay, let me get the PowerPoint up here. Okay, you seeing that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so good evening. So I've written on drunkenness as a defense to murder, and this is one of the cases I used to highlight the issue. And it is Newark resident Robert Martin, who killed his wife and baby daughter in June of 1881 after an evening of drinking at local bars. The case does have some significance because of various appeals, attempts to gain a pardon from the governor, and there was also commentary from the New Jersey Law Journal, as well as a renowned neurologist. The crime itself, unfortunately, was all too common, but it provides a good opportunity to discuss ideas about temperance, medicine, and the law as it connects to alcohol use. So I'm going to share some of the details of the crime with you, and I've tried to add some additional Newark context from what I did in the book to get a feel for attitudes towards alcohol and crime in the city. Oops, there we go. So on June 15th, 1881, Robert Martin, who lived on Nassau Street, which is where this blue arrow is here, and the street's actually not there anymore, was walking back from Eagle Rock, and he stopped somewhere along the way for a few glasses of ale with a friend. He was back in Newark around 5:30, and he stopped at McGuire's Saloon, a neighborhood bar that's here at the corner of Nesbitt and Morris and Essex and Morris Railroad Avenue. He continued drinking there. He had 5 or 6 brandies and a few glasses of gin, going back and forth between McGuire's and Fullalov's, which was on Nassau Street. He ended up at Fullalov's a little after 9 o'clock that evening, where the owner told him he'd had enough and he told him to go home. So he returns home. He's on the same street. He lives on 86 Nassau Street. Robert was 50 years old. He was born in England. He lives there with his second wife, Sarah. She's 32 years old, also born in England, and they've been married for 12 years. He has 3 sons from his first marriage. The youngest, Edward, is 16, and he lives with them. And they have 3 children together, all of whom are there that night. Charles, who is 11, 18-month-old Nellie, and 6-month-old Florence. He gets home, he argues with his wife over the whereabouts of his son, Edward, and also purportedly about his drinking. During the course of the argument, Robert gets his pistol from a box in the bedroom. He follows his wife down the stairs. She's holding their 18-month-old, and he shoots 3 times. Sarah Martin dies immediately. The baby Nellie received what was described as 2 ghastly wounds in the abdomen, and she died several hours later. Martin was taken into police custody almost immediately, and he declared, "Oh, I am going to be hung. I have shot my wife." So what's typical of the sensationalism you'd find that characterizes the press in this period, Martin's crime was reported as one of the most appalling murders known in the annals of crime in this city. Alcohol-related crime, however, was not uncommon, and it did often affect women and families. And if you look at some general reporting in the papers around this time, you can get a sense of just how pervasive. And these articles were actually chosen just fairly randomly as a sampling. So in January that same year, this is earlier, you see a list of police items. We've got the second items already. We have an altercation at Bruckner's Saloon on Bank Street, where we have a fight broke out. Thomas Tive, Central Avenue, was found drunk, suffering from a severe cut on his head. We have another barroom brawl where John Hanley was struck in the head with a bottle. Got some old-fashioned horse stealing in here too. And then we have an example of domestic violence between Patrick Owen and his wife. Alcohol is not mentioned there, but again, domestic violence, fairly common. Another interesting story that was just a month prior to this, again, to show some of the dangers of alcohol to particularly women. You have a hack driver who had 2 young girls who were characterized as being in a state of beastly drunkenness. And he had plied them with whiskey. Somebody caught on to what was going on, and he supposedly had planned for some immoral purposes for these girls. So that made the papers. And then this last one is interesting in this sort of, man bites dog way. We see here that it was an assault here by a wife against her husband. And it starts off saying assaults on wives by brutal husbands are a frequent occurrence, but it's rarely a husband appears in court charging his wife. And she was described as being frequently drunk. So stories about drinking and domestic violence were certainly very common. I had hoped when I, went back to this case to find more specific temperance commentary. I didn't find a lot in Newark, but historically, as far as temperance, Newark seemed to have the usual. They had a chapter of the Washingtonians earlier in the century, some religious temperance organizations. They had hosted a Women's Christian Temperance Union meeting in 1876. And Martin's story did take on the classic temperance narrative, the idea of a good man ruined by alcohol. Early accounts of the crime focused on the shocking details of the crime, contrasted with the supposedly happy home occupied by the Martins. The North Morning Register in particular had several editorials on the case. This one was just a few days after the murder. You note that it mentions sort of the thrill of horror, which frankly sold a lot of paper, so they covered these crimes in detail. But also, we pity the man who allows himself to become such a slave to intoxicating drink that he loses all love for wife and child of any comfortable home with its humanizing influences. And continuing on, it notes the murderer rarely does his bloody work without the aid of some maddening stimulant. And you see this idea very common in temperance rhetoric, that alcohol somehow shares some of the blame for the crime. On the one hand, this provides an argument for prohibition, temperance, the only way to stop these problems are to ban alcohol, but it also ends up providing some rationale for the criminal's actions. So Martin's story was reported in what was in this era a familiar narrative of seemingly idyllic domestic life destroyed by alcohol. Martin's class and his background likely had something to do with this. A lot of the support for temperance prohibition was often tied in with nativist views and fears of immigrants, who abused alcohol. Martin, who had been born in England, had worked as a mechanic. He was quite well off. It was noted he could support his family in comfortable circumstances, even though he hadn't worked in several years. He was living off, whatever money he had in investments. The crime was described as taking place in a comfortable and what had been a happy home. The house on Nassau Street was described as a neat two-story frame house. The lower floor had a kitchen, a sitting room, and a small room and an extension. There were 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. And it was said the entire house is furnished neatly and comfortably, the walls of the rooms being covered with nice pictures, and shows that the people must have lived in a respectable manner. When not drinking, it was reported Robert was a caring family man. But when he drank, his wife, quote, being a temperate woman, was of course opposed to his drunken excesses. And unsurprisingly, the reality of their lives was more complicated. After Sarah and Robert married, the family lived in Cuba for a while, where Robert had charge of a railroad shop building and repairing locomotives in Guantanamo. After the murder, Sarah, Martin's mother and sister, recounted that he had treated his wife badly and beat her when they were in Cuba. And at one point, Sarah had actually come home to live with her mother in Newark. Someone like Sarah Martin wouldn't have had a lot of options. One study of divorce records in this period does note intemperance was a deciding factor in over 1/4 of American divorces. However, in this case, Robert came to get her after about a year, and she went back to Cuba with him. The entire family returned to Newark about 3 years prior to the murder. During the trial, 2 of the sons also testified their father frequently abused their mother, and on one occasion a few months earlier, he had threatened to shoot her. So the trial was in October 1881, and it was widely covered. Martin was represented by ex-judge Caleb S. Titsworth, who put forth a defense of insanity, but he also suggested there was an exculpatory lack of intent. So the goal here was hopefully he gets his client off for insanity, but that was a gamble. If that didn't work, the idea was you say that the drunkenness meant he couldn't form the intent required to commit first-degree murder, which carried the death penalty, and that hopefully he could get second-degree or even manslaughter or some sort of lower charge. Titsworth said Martin had his faults, namely drinking, but among all those who knew him, he was generous, clever, gentlemanly, never hurting or wronging anyone. He also threw out as part of the defense that Martin was perhaps inordinately affected by the alcohol because he suffered from malaria. He said Martin had no memory of the events, and he also claimed his actions were accidental. He was trying to earn his money there. Apparently he was paid quite well. Insanity and intent were the crucial issues. A number of physicians testified for the defense. Dr. H.C. Hendry had known Martin for several years, and he said he was suffering from chronic alcoholism, and that his condition was not the direct effect of immediate drinking, meaning he wasn't just drunk, which would be no excuse to the crime. County physician Peter V.P. Hewlett said he spoke to Martin shortly after the crime, and that then the prisoner identified himself as Champagne Charlie and began to sing. So in his opinion, he thought Martin showed signs of aberration of mind and basically acted like a crazy man. The prosecution, led by Colonel G.N. Abeal, countered the idea that Martin's behavior was due to anything more than just being drunk. And Police Surgeon Joshua Ware Reed also assured the jury this was nothing more than intoxication and there were no signs of insanity. It was reported that the jury initially was divided, that they stood at 7 for murder in the first degree and 5 for murder in the second degree, before unanimously agreeing that Martin should be convicted of the more serious charge, which carried a penalty of death. Within months, however, supportive public sentiment swirled around Martin. In November of 1881, Reverend James Boyd Brady of the Central Methodist Episcopal Church preached a sermon titled "The Kind Reprieve." He characterized Martin as, quote, "another case of a real good fellow doomed by drink." And there was a petition that circulated requesting a commutation of his sentence. It was supposedly signed by many of the grand jury that indicted Martin, all the jury that tried the case, almost every prominent lawyer in Essex County, many clergymen, and a host of the best citizens. An application for a writ of error was also filed in early 1882, based on two reasons. One was they said the word deliberate should have appeared in the indictment if he was going to be convicted of first-degree murder, and it did not. And the defense also took issue with Reed's testimony, because when he recounted how Martin acted, he read from his notes, and they said that gave the impression that he was behaving in a much more rational way than if he had used his actual words. So Martin's life was spared initially by a reprieve from Governor George C. Ludlow, just days before his scheduled hanging in March 1882. When the news got out, it was reported that, quote, "on the streets, general satisfaction at the result was expressed on all hands, and many persons who never saw Robert Martin in their lives shook hands warmly and expressed hopes that the month of life granted to the poor man by the governor may be indefinitely extended." The New Jersey Law Journal also said news of the reprieve brought a sense of relief from an impending horror, the execution of a man whom the people cannot bring themselves to think morally deserves so dreadful a punishment. And the New Jersey Law Journal came out forcefully to say that this should have been murder in the second degree, not first degree. Despite numerous efforts over the next year or so to obtain a new trial or commutation of sentence for Martin, his execution was ultimately scheduled for January 1884. And it would coincide with that of another murderer, James Graves. Graves had murdered 13-year-old Eddie Sodden, a neighborhood boy, but this one seemed likely a case of mental illness, and no alcohol was involved here. Graves was often described as an imbecile and more problematically an infidel. Now, as Graves' attorneys mounted a last chance bid to obtain a pardon just days before his hanging, they called on Edward C. Spitzka to examine their client. Spitzka was a renowned neurologist who had testified just recently that Charles Guiteau, who had assassinated President James Garfield, was insane. And Spitzka believed Graves was insane, and he derided the public support for Martin. He couldn't believe that when this went before the Court of Pardons, that they unanimously denied the petition for Graves, yet they were split on the one for Martin. But he does observe that it may be said in their behalf that they correctly represented the popular sentiment, which was indifferent regarding Graves, while the sentimental part of the community made itself heard in numerous petitions on behalf of Martin and visits of morbidly inclined females to the jail. And I wish I knew a little bit more about that, but I don't. For Spitzka, Graves represented a case of legitimate insanity. Martin, who we saw as drunk, did not. It didn't help either Graves or Martin that there was a growing backlash against the insanity defense at this time. On January 3rd, 1884, both men were hanged in the courtyard of the old Essex County Jail. Martin had continued to hope for a last-minute pardon, but none came. And despite his calm manner walking to the gallows, it was said his struggles were fearful. He had apparently freed one of his hands as he was hanging and was attempting to loosen the rope around his neck. And you see some reporting on that in the second article. He was buried in Fairmount Cemetery off Central Avenue, next to the wife and child he had killed. So that's just one example of crime and alcohol in Newark, alongside this sort of, complicated temperance narrative that often viewed alcohol as an accomplice to crime. Happy to answer questions later on, and I look forward to hearing from my fellow speakers. And let me...
Great. So my talk, I put the question mark in, right? The temperance movement in Newark, because Newark is usually associated with breweries and with opposition to prohibition. We don't usually associate Newark with opposition to alcohol consumption. But Newark also had a strong progressive and reform tradition that associated drinking with crime and corruption. And Michele, I think, has done a great job of tracing out some of the ways in which this would play out at the time, some of these associations with alcohol and crime or wife abuse and things like this. Temperance activism in Newark, like America as a whole, was concentrated in two eras, the early 1800s and the early 1900s, or the late 1800s, early 1900s. Let's see. My slides are not advancing. I wonder why that is.
Up or down key works.
That's what I'm trying to do. Great, I'm sorry about that. For some reason, the slides were not advancing, but well, okay. This image from Newark in the 1820s gives you a sense that, Newark was not yet a big city. Industry was just beginning. The town was surrounded by farms. Indeed, there were farms within Newark's borders. Most Newarkers were Protestants, and the influence of Puritan morality was still quite strong. There were not many taverns in the town, and there were serious legal restrictions on the sale of alcohol in Newark. God, I know what's wrong, but my slides are not advancing.
I have them up, George, if you want
Okay.
to continue.
Great, I will continue. And can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Newark took part in the religious revivals that shook America during the early 1800s, the so-called Second Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening had been during the colonial period. These religious revivals centered on evangelical Protestantism and a call for repentance and salvation. Temperance, or the total abstinence from alcohol consumption, was a centerpiece of religious revivals. People were invited to accept Jesus as their savior and to take the pledge, giving up intoxicating beverages. Next slide. Great. So this image of taking the pledge, this is one that was this particular image was widely distributed in Newark by the Washingtonians, who are a Baptist sect. Michele mentioned them, but they were temperance was a big part of what they stood for. And you can see, right, the man who's clearly the drunkard is signing the pledge. His wife is thanking God that this is happening, and the implication of the illustration is that the father's alcohol consumption has impoverished his family, but now that a new leaf is being turned over. During the 1840s, Newark actually had two separate temperance newspapers, the Newark Temperance Star and the Newark Temperance Advocate. So clearly temperance was a big phenomena in Newark. Next. Temperance had widespread support among Newark's churches and among the city's elite, most notably Theodore Frielingheisen. He practiced law in Newark. He was a mayor of Newark during the 1830s, and of course, a long-serving senator from New Jersey. Frielingheisen was also president of the American Bible Society, and he was a very strong advocate of temperance. Now, temperance is strongly associated with American Protestantism, so much so, next. So much so that we forget there was a moment in the early 19th century in which many Irish Catholics supported temperance. In Ireland in the 1830s, Father Theobald Matthew led a hugely popular and very successful temperance movement. Again, something we don't usually associate with Ireland. Father Matthew was probably the most famous Irishman in the decades before the famine, with the exception of Daniel O'Connell, the political leader. Father Matthew was much admired by Irish Americans, and one of his biggest disciples in America was Father Patrick Moran of Newark. I've not been able to locate an image of him, but this is his parish church, St. John's of Newark, which of course is still standing. And he was the rector there for 30 years, from 1833 to 1866. Moran was hugely important in building Catholic community, especially Irish Catholic community in Newark. He's responsible for the building of St. Patrick's Newark that became the first cathedral. And Father Moran also spearheaded a huge temperance revival among Irish Catholics in Newark during the 1840s, in which many Irish Catholics in Newark signed the pledge, or as I said, took Father Moran's pledge. Now, this early temperance movement among Protestants and also among Catholics in Newark never completely disappeared, but it lost its power and influence as America grew in size and diversity. Next. You can contrast this image of Newark in the 1870s with the earlier one from the 1820s. By the late 19th century, Newark had been radically transformed from a sleepy agricultural community to a large, crowded industrial city. Newark was no longer a Protestant town dominated by people of British heritage. Newark was a city of immigrants, most of whom were Catholics and Jews, and hostility to alcohol consumption was not part of their ethnic heritage, except for this moment in the 1830s and 40s when some Irish Catholics did take part in it. You don't see this happening later in this later temperance movement that I'll discuss. Restrictions on the sale of alcohol had been greatly liberalized in Newark from the 1850s on, and even laws forbidding the sale of alcohol on Sunday were openly flouted by the late 1800s. And in some cases, selling alcohol on Sunday, you'd get fined $10 for doing so, and it was much cheaper just to pay that fine because bars could make a lot more than $10 selling alcohol on Sunday. Next slide, please. Newark was also a city of breweries. You see here Ballantyne's on the Passaic River as being one of several. Newark was probably the most important center of beer production in America after St. Louis and Milwaukee. And the breweries employed many Newarkers, especially German Americans. Next slide. Newark was certainly a city of bars and saloons. By 1900, there were more than 1,200 saloons in Newark, almost one on every corner. They often served as neighborhood social centers for Newark's many ethnic communities. And this is Nicodemi's, an Italian wine bar in the Old First Ward. Now, a revived temperance movement developed in America in the late 1800s. And this temperance movement of the late 1800s was mostly centered in small towns and villages of the Midwest and the South. It was strongest among Protestants of British descent. Temperance advocates looked with horror at America's big cities, which they saw as places of political corruption, crime, and moral disorder, and teeming with unruly immigrants. The production and consumption of alcohol were blamed for much of this corruption and disorder and crime. Next. The revived temperance movement of the late 1800s was dominated by women. Women were very much involved in the temperance movement of the early 1800s, but they did not lead it and dominate it as much as they did in the later temperance movement. Its most famous organization was the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in the Midwest in 1873. By 1900, it had 150,000 members nationwide. This made it the largest women's group in America, indeed one of the largest organizations of any kind in the United States. The white ribbon was its symbol of purity. Temperance advocates were often referred to as white ribboners. There was a whole separate temperance subculture which developed in the late 1800s and the early 20th century, with its own newspapers, books, music, restaurants, hotels, and resorts. Ocean Grove on the Jersey Shore was a temperance summer resort locally. Soft drinks, which we're all familiar with today, were originally marketed in the United States as temperance beverages. Next slide. All right, Emma Bourne, she's completely forgotten today. She doesn't appear in any of the standard Newark histories. She doesn't even appear in any of the recent biographical collections of famous Newarkers. And yet in her day, she was one of the most famous Newarkers with a national and international reputation. Bourne succeeded her mother, Mary Hill, as leader of the Newark WCTU from the 1890s. So Newark did have a branch of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Although Newark was certainly not a center of temperance activism at this time, it did have some people who were very active in the movement, and Emma Bourne being the most famous New Jersey and in fact one of the most famous Americans in the temperance movement at this time. From 1891 to 1910, Bourne was the state president of the New Jersey WCTU. She was a compelling speaker and an energetic organizer. She greatly expanded the group throughout the state. By the late 1890s, the New Jersey WCTU was growing faster than any other state chapter in the United States. Bourne even created a small publishing company to produce temperance literature at the third of the cost charged by commercial printers. So she's clearly a very enterprising person. Now, support for the WCTU in Newark came predominantly from white middle-class Protestant women in the Forest Hill and Roseville neighborhoods. Those were the fancy neighborhoods in Newark at the time. There was next to no support for the WCTU in Newark's immigrant neighborhoods in the late 19th and early 20th century. Next slide. But there was very strong support from African-American women and the Black churches in Newark. The New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs was founded in 1915 specifically as a temperance organization. It very quickly branched out to support other causes like women's suffrage or causes anti-segregation and anti-discrimination. The Reverend Florence Spearing Randolph, she was a minister of the AME Zion Church. She was the first president, for many years, the president of this organization. She was the minister of an AME Zion Church in Newark at one point, but she also was pastored AME Zion churches in several towns in New Jersey during this period. So I mean, I think this is important, that although temperance is not very strong among Newark's immigrant communities, it was not just an organization of a movement of white women, but it was a movement of white women, some white women and Protestant white women, but also of Black women. Although interestingly enough, the movement, like so much else during the period, was segregated. There wasn't a lot of give and take or cooperation between the white women and Black women, but they were going at temperance among their own communities, but without a lot of coordination with each other. Next. Newark was also, there was also a movement for progressive reform in Newark, and support for temperance also came from progressive campaigns against prostitution gambling, and drug addiction. So this report on the social evil conditions in Newark, New Jersey is a very interesting report that was issued in 1914. It was essentially a study of prostitution in Newark. Social evil was a kind of a euphemism of the time for prostitution. And this 1914 report documented widespread prostitution in Newark that was based in the saloons, with active support from bartenders. So if you wanted to find a prostitute, you would go to a bar, and often some of these bars and saloons in Newark had rooms attached or rooms upstairs where you could take a prostitute. So again, this implication that the drinking wasn't just bad in and of itself, but it was associated with other kinds of social problems like prostitution or drug addiction. You could buy, cocaine in bars. That was something that the report documented. And gambling was also often associated in bars as well. So this idea that people in the temperance movement saw saloons as sort of dens of iniquity. There was not a lot of gray area here. Next slide, please. But it's really World War I, which is what gave temperance its biggest boost and finally enabled prohibition to take effect. Alcohol was seen as the enemy of wartime efficiency. Alcohol was also seen as a threat to the health and purity of American servicemen. It was against the law in the United States during World War I to serve drinks to soldiers or sailors. So for the armed services, there was prohibition during World War I. And this, of course, also made the association that alcohol was bad, that the healthy and noble young men who are fighting for democracy, we need to protect them from alcohol and the evils of alcohol. Wartime food conservation also restricted the availability of grains for alcohol production. This is, you had voluntary food restraint during World War I, but there were 2 million American soldiers serving in France. We needed to feed them. The United States was providing a lot of food to our allies, especially to England and France. And so all the grain that was used to make beer or to make other alcohol, that was so much less grain available for bread production during the war. Next slide. The temperance advocates branded the breweries as unpatriotic for producing beer during wartime. Some people suspected that German-American brewers were anti-American or even pro-German. I mean, there's no evidence for this, but these are the kind of allegations that were made during the war. These are 2 advertisements from the time from Newark newspapers that are sort of typical, that emphasized how wasteful it was to spend money on drink during wartime. And they would, for example, point out, New Jerseyans spend this much money on alcohol in a given year, and that money could be better spent on buying war bonds, or that money could pay for so many submarines, or so many warships to fight against Germany during the war. Next slide, please. So Newark's breweries were running scared. The liquor industry in New Jersey and in Newark was quite frightened by all of this. They needed to assert their patriotism and counter the growing support to restrict or eliminate alcohol production. So Bevo is one example. This is a non-alcoholic energy drink, probably the first energy drink that was made by Anheuser-Busch, which had a brewery in Newark and an office in Newark. So it's pushing this new beverage, which really, frankly, never caught on, as a patriotic drink. And it's look, the breweries are not, just wasting grain. The breweries are also doing this, making this healthy drink for the soldiers. And the breweries are also trying to associate prohibition with communism. So the second ad from the Newark papers makes the point that, of course, the Russian Revolution had just taken place. The Bolsheviks had taken over. And so this advertisement says, well, one of the first things the Bolsheviks did when they took over Russia was they ended alcohol production. So it's like, prohibition is it's a communist idea. It's not something that we want in a democracy. Next slide. And then Feigenspend Brewery, Christian Feigenspend was one of Newark's biggest breweries, took out a whole series of ads in Newark newspapers and newspapers also in other New Jersey cities about why I drink beer. There's a whole series of these. And so you've got the factory worker who says he drinks beer to steady his nerves. You got the old folks who say that that it has tonic properties, that beer strengthens them. There's, I just gave you these two examples. There's also one of a nursing mother who's saying that beer is good for her, beer is good for her baby. So this is the whole idea that beer was a healthy drink. Now this whole series of ads of why I drink beer was just too much for the temperance community in Newark at the time. Next slide. And the temperance people took out this counter ad on why I don't drink beer, in which they cite a number of medical authorities on why beer is really unhealthy, and one doctor who says beer makes you stupid. So they were quick to counter this really very desperate attempt on the part of the breweries to try to halt prohibition. Next slide. But it's really wartime grain shortages that were used to gain support in Congress for a Prohibition Amendment. So this 18th Amendment to the Constitution to make the production, transport, and sale of intoxicating liquors illegal. What an intoxicating liquor was not spelled out, and there was some confusion and debate over this. And a number of politicians thought that this probably only referred to hard liquor, like whiskey or gin, and that it would not include beer or wine. So there were some people who supported an 18th Amendment, Prohibition Amendment, thinking that beer and wine would be exempted from this. Congress passed the 18th Amendment December 18th, 1917. It was sent to the states for ratification. You needed 36 states to ratify. Finally, on January 16th, 1919, you had the requisite number of states. New Jersey, as you can see, did not ratify. The dark colored states are the ones that ratified. So New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut. There was, of course, very strong Northeast sentiment against prohibition for all kinds of reasons, but certainly the liquor industry was very much centered in some of these places. And you notice also by the time that the amendment was ratified, the war was over. So the wartime emergency that had pushed the 18th Amendment through, by the time it was ratified, the war was no longer in place, but prohibition was now in place. It wasn't quite clear what exactly this would mean. Next slide. But Congress passed the Volstead Act in October 1919 to clear up some of the ambiguities. And one of the things that the Volstead Act pointed out or defined was that intoxicating liquors would include beer and wine. And so a lot of Newarkers and New Jerseyans felt that that a bait and switch had taken place, that some people, some politicians supported the 18th Amendment on the belief that it would not include beer and wine. And now it was made clear that it would include beer and wine. The Volstead Act defined the date at which prohibition would go into effect, January 17th, 1920, and you see some federal agents pouring alcohol down a drain. The Volstead Act also gave teeth to the enforcement of it, gave the federal government considerable powers enforcing prohibition, because the fear was that certain states like New Jersey that hadn't voted for it wouldn't do much about enforcement, so that the federal government was given these powers. Okay, I'm going to end there, and you can turn it over to our next presenter, Laura.
Thanks, George. You leave us in a perfect place. So I'm going to share my screen now. All right, so depending on who you ask, the feds, the rum runners, the guys slinging bathtub gin in a speakeasy, anywhere between 40 to 70% of all illegal liquor coming into the United States totally during Prohibition, which George said began in 1920, ended in 1933, flowed through Newark. Newark had it all. I mean, all of you know this. It's an urban East Coast democratic city with a large and active port. It has a neighbor. It's a smallish island. It's fairly well populated, called Manhattan. It has an extensive rail system. And as George was telling us, we have a large scale breweries that had an enthusiastic population to keep them in business. What attracted me personally to bootlegging were the stories that my great-grandparents and grandparents used to tell us about their associations with some local families in Brooklyn, you know, like the Gambinos and the Genovese. And then I arrived in Newark and I started to hear some more stories, like the two pictured here, one about Richie the Boot and some Yankee named Joe. I mean, you know, he's not famous or anything like that. And Dutch Schultz and his fatal bathroom visit on East Park Street. We have Abner Longy's Woolman and Joe Reinfeld and Colonel Ivor Reeves. And my problem for tonight was that I only had a few minutes to talk and a lot of stories I can tell. So I was tasked with discussing the problems with enforcing prohibition, though I'm not really sure if we could consider it a problem when there wasn't all that many people trying to do it. The 18th Amendment, as George was saying, was not ratified in New Jersey until 1922, and it was a bitterly contested 2-year fight, primarily between the dry Republicans and the wet Democrats. And even after ratification, politicians openly defied the law by drinking at public events. And New Jersey's Governor Edward Edwards campaigned on the slogan, quote, he wanted to make New Jersey as wet as the Atlantic Ocean, and then went on to say, I intend to interfere with the enforcement of prohibition in this state. So he didn't leave a lot of nuance in his campaign. And our Newark Mayor, Thomas Raymond, actually also ran in that race, and he ran as the lone wet Republican candidate. And like most East Coast cities, as you can see from George's map, Newark in particular with its large immigrant population, there wasn't a ton of popular support for prohibition. And then of course we get to law enforcement. So I'm going to start with the two men who I believe are essentially the main contributors to Newark's inability to keep dry. And that's Longy's Woolman and Joe Reinfeld. And as I previously mentioned, there are plenty of others, but these guys, to me, they really run the show. Longy is arguably one of the East Coast's most powerful bootleggers. He dropped out of school at 13 to help supplement his family's income. And on Broome Street, he found work first as a vegetable peddler, and then he moved to small-time gambling operations. When the government enacted prohibition, always looking for the next opportunity, he traded in his horse and wagon and hired himself as a transport to protect liquor shipments. And you did not want to attempt to hijack Longy's trucks. Often you were shot up immediately. His crew, they drove Mack Bulldog AC model trucks that were originally built for World War I. They were literally armored vehicles. And if not for trucks, they did large Studebakers or sedans. And the rear seats were removed and they souped up their 6-cylinder engines. And they were equipped with spotlights to blind pursuers. They had chains in the back to blind people with clouds of dust. And you even used their license plates. So you knew your bootlegger by their license plate. So you would stop along the street and then you would buy your liquor right from the car, which I find to be very convenient. So Joe Reinfeld controlled the vast majority of all liquor entering into the United States, and most of it came through Newark's ports, and much of it came from the Canadian islands of Miquelon and St. Pierre. So boats would anchor 12 miles out in international waters, that's the line, out on the Jersey Shore, and it was known as Rum Row. So, and I've seen reports of women standing on the decks of those boats, holding competitive price signs so you would know which boat would come to go to and which to get the best price. So the speedboats would have to, pull up to make those purchases. So they would have to either outfox or outspeed or essentially overpay the Coast Guard in order to get back and forth. And these are some of the boats and some of the, fires and explosions and, chases, and the real McCoy comes out of these boats. So Reinfeld hired Longy to transport his shipments from the docks to the warehouses where they could be distributed throughout the city. So while working for Reinfeld, Longy began his own bootlegging operation, and he soon became Reinfeld's chief rival. He was good at what he did. So Reinfeld realized that it would be more lucrative to concede to Longy's demand of 50% of his business than to actually compete with him. And according to the IRS, between 1928 and 1933, Reinfeld and Longy made $40 million in liquor sales alone. So it was a big time business. The Coast Guard was not the only agency on the payroll, of course. So one story that I read takes place on Prince Street warehouse, on Prince Street in a warehouse after midnight. And the story revolves around James Rutkin, who was a childhood friend of and an associate of Longhi's. And he was overseeing the unloading of a liquor when two plainclothes detectives make a visit. And they say to him, "You the boss here?" He says, "Yeah, what's up?" And they say, "You're under arrest." And he's like, "For what?" "Storing illegal liquor." And Rutkin goes, "You must be out of your fucking mind. Do you know who rents this warehouse?" And they say to him, "I don't give a shit if Calvin Coolidge rents it, wise guy." So of course they didn't know who rented it. And if they did, they wouldn't have bothered to charge him. The following afternoon in the courthouse, it was crowded with people and everyone seemed to know Rutkin. The lawyers, the clerks, the officers, "Hey, Rutkin," as he comes into the courthouse. So Rutkin's lawyer says, "Your Honor, I can give you 500 reasons why my client should be on the street right now." We heard "to my chambers," was followed by "case dismissed." So Rutkin emerges with $500 less than he entered, but he did save the court the trouble of misplacing his paperwork. And on this slide, we have actual FBI files on Rutkin's attempt to actually extort money from Joe Reinfeld. And there's plenty of court testimony from these trials, and they're well worth a read if you are interested in Prohibition, and particularly in Longhi and James Rutkin. So I really got interested in Prohibition and law enforcement through Colonel Ira Reeves, and he was the director of the New Jersey Prohibition Bureau, which was headquartered in 1060 Broad Street. And he knew plenty about the hard times the court had with their paperwork. He described the legal department, quote, "as anyone with a smattering of legal knowledge can see how evidence of a perfectly good case could be so bungled as to defeat the ends of justice, that it is often purposely bungled in such a manner that cannot be disputed," end quote. Reeves had served in the Army in the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and in World War I. He was wounded several times. He is also the recipient of a Distinguished Service Medal. And from September 1926 to May 1927, he had the unenviable task of trying to make one of, if not the wettest states in the country not be dry, maybe moist, possibly damp. I mean, it doesn't actually matter because he didn't get remotely close to either. He chronicles his time as director in the very entertaining Old Rum River Revelations of a Prohibition Administrator. And he begins with delusion. I mean, literally, he begins with delusion. It's the first word that he writes in the book. And he goes on with, quote, "The illusion was not long with me. Instead of being merely in a dream, I soon found out I was in a nightmare reality. Before long, I found myself in a whirlpool of disloyalty, intrigue, espionage, within and without service, graft, lack of support from Washington, lack of sympathy of the public, double crossing everywhere, cutthroat tactics on the part of those for whom I had every reason and right to expect support from the top down, from the bottom up," end quote. And I can understand his frustration because the turnover rate within the Prohibition Bureau was 25%, and the Bureau itself was considered essentially a training ground for future bootleggers. You'd find out what the tactics are of your police, and then you'd make contacts when you were arresting people, and then you would be able to get into business. So it was a smart career move if you wanted to get into the bootlegging business. So when he resigned, Reeves complained that there was no public sympathy for Prohibition or for those who attempted to enforce it. And among crowds of onlookers during raids, and there's all kinds of stories about what they were up to when a raid was going on, there was no thank yous essentially sent in his direction. In fact, some onlookers tend to have something else in mind. And he recounts one such instance. So I'm going to read it to you. This is a pretty famous photo. So you might know a version of this particular story. So an officer calls him to say that they have stopped a freight train that has a bunch of beer on it within the city limits of Newark. So he goes to say, "I had not witnessed such a capture, but it was reported to me over the phone, and I was asked for instructions as to what the disposition to make of the contraband. It had been in our practice, in the past, when a seizure of this kind was made within city limits, to haul the beer to the city dump, break the heads of the barrel, and after emptying them, burn them. In this particular case, the agent in charge informed me that there was a large vacant lot in the back of the railroad yards where the seizure had been made. I asked him, could the destruction take place there? And he said it could. What I did not know is when the instructions were given was that the yard was bounded by a dense industrial population. Shortly after the agents began unloading the barrels of beer, a large and obviously thirsty crowd assembled and began to take the barrels away from the federal men. The Prohibition forces soon found themselves overwhelmed, and they were absolutely helpless. The crowd overran the lot and were soon engaged in rolling the barrels to the nearest street, where they were quickly loaded into waiting trucks and passenger automobiles and hurried away. Seeking relief, one of the agents excitedly called the office. We immediately responded with 6 or 8 men. And since we had judged from the alarm that a riot was taking place, we took sawed-off shotguns with us. When we arrived at the scene with our shotguns, it was amusing to see how quickly the crowd had scattered without any threatening gestures on our part. And it was not necessary to make the threats, for the very sight of the shotguns was sufficient. This incident taught me a lesson: never sanction the destruction of any quantity of beer in the presence of a large crowd, especially on a hot, sweltering day. And I think that probably is a good lesson for all of us. And we can't know the full impact of the inability to enforce prohibition that it had on Newark, whether the residents saw their politicians as criminals for opening defying the laws, or that they were taking reasonable action against something that was unlawful. We don't know if the lucrative deals officers received from bootleggers was seen as undermining public trust or as an inevitable response to the reality on the streets. We do know that some of the money made by numerous criminal enterprises did sustain some communities and neighborhoods in the following years of the Depression. We know, as Michele has told us, there were murders and crimes committed that destroyed families. We know that there was plenty of new technologies and ingenious tools and operations that were spurred from the era. People got very clever in how to move liquor around. And we know for sure that it produced a lot of really interesting stories. So I'm excited to have the panel discussion with Michele and George, and with all of you, to talk more about prohibition in all of its forms. So thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks so much, Michele and George and Laura. And why don't we start with, if you have a question for each other based on your presentations and how they link together.
I have a question for Michele. Do we know if it was more regional, like the use of alcohol as an excuse for murder, or was it like across the United States, like rural or urban spaces more likely to use it as their defense?
It was everywhere. It was just, especially by mid-19th century, because there had been some successful defenses based on insanity. By the time you get past mid-century, you had moral insanity, which really just kind of expanded the definition. And then also when you start having the degrees of murder, which change state by state, but when you start seeing that, everybody's also throwing that in. So it wasn't uncommon to have, a defense based on insanity, and then also try to say there was no intent and get a lesser degree. It was something you used only, if it was clear you were guilty, obviously. But usually, when mostly drunk men kill their wives, it's pretty clear that they did it. They're standing there drunk and bloody, But yeah, it was common everywhere. And as soon as you saw any of the states start instituting the different degrees of murder, you saw that drunkenness was always, in cases of drunkenness, they always used the sort of lesser degree also to try to save themselves from being executed.
I guess I have a question for Laura. Would you say that this is just evidence that you can't really enforce a law in any given locality if there's no support for it among the local population and the politicians?
It seems so. I mean, there was no wide scale support of this law. I mean, and it wasn't only that these prohibition officers were making $3,000 a year and can make $3,000 like a month on the street. It was everybody was drinking and everybody was the politician, you know, as you were talking through, like it's a part of culture that people did not want to relinquish and did not want to be policed over. So yeah, I don't think if the law is that unpopular, I don't know if it's sustainable to maintain that.
George,
Okay,
that's the case. I could give you an example from the 18th century, same thing. And if the population doesn't support it, they're going to find a way to avoid it. Michele, Gordon Bond points out that it was Hannibal Goodwin who accompanied Mr. Martin to the gallows. So
Yeah, he had visited him at the jail actually quite frequently and was one of sort of, many who supported him and had hoped for the commutation of his sentence.
yeah, George, before Prohibition, Gail Momgreen's asking if there's evidence that the temperance movement ever affected the sale of alcohol beverages significantly in Newark.
I don't think, not in the late 19th and early 20th century. In the earlier period, I think there is, and I'm more familiar with the actual situation in Ireland, for example, where in the 1830s there was a huge drop in tax revenue from alcohol because the temperance movement was so successful there. So, I mean, that's the way you try to measure it because alcohol is heavily taxed by governments, and so there is evidence in places in the United States, including New Jersey, where there is a fall in revenue from in the early 1800s as a result of some of these. Whether Newark, I don't have that information for Newark, but it wouldn't surprise me if there was some fall off. But it's very temporary. It tends to be these moments.
And Keith Delaney is asking if Newark's reputation as a home to a great number of speakeasies had any significant effect on the way the local courts looked at the use of alcohol as a defense. Did city politicians push judges to steer clear of adjudications blaming alcohol use? Sounds like his use of the word speakeasies makes me think of Prohibition, whereas the adjudications blaming alcohol use makes me think more of your topic about domestic abuse and that sort of thing. But how did the courts handle complaints or arrests related to rum running or avoiding prohibition? Laura?
Yeah, so the court testimonies that I have read don't look particularly favorably at, the rum runners. There's not like, an obvious overrun of the court system that all of them got off. But you see, like with the case of James Ruckin, whose case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in New Jersey, that there's quite a lot of space where they're able to get off on all kinds of different types of charges. Who was paying for their lawyers or who was paying for whatever, the problem with crime history, as I'm sure Michele can attest to too, is they don't keep excellent records of the crimes as they are committing them. So you're trying to follow the paper trail of different types of criminals and, the stories that they were telling, later on. So there's not like wide scale, like everybody gets off, but there's not like wide scale, everyone's in jail either. So I think it's probably the support in Prohibition itself.
And over the whole period, the 50 years and such, is there a difference in how the public or the courts or the police handled the beer and wine versus spirits?
That's a big question.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if there's a discernible difference. There's different people running the different types of alcohol. And it was still legal to brew beer. It just had to be near beer, but to get to near beer, most of the time you had to brew the beer and then de-alcoholize it. So some of that beer, not surprisingly, maybe, got on a truck, maybe, ended up at a warehouse to be distributed or on a train. So I think it's harder in some cases to prosecute that because it's not illegal in which to do it.
That earlier question, I think is interesting about the courts and alcohol during Prohibition. And I know that's not something that any of us were prepared to talk about, But that would be interesting, you know, if during the period of Prohibition, people committed crimes while they were drunk, could there be any way to, you know, like, oh, my client was drunk and was impaired? Well, you know, that's a kind of defense that was used a lot, but under Prohibition, you're not supposed to be drinking at all. So I don't know, would that defense even be allowed in court? It's just that's an interesting question, but yeah, I don't know if anyone's done any work on that.
Yeah, I don't know that period. I'd assume in theory, because they let a lot of things speak to intent. So if you were just using it for the intent part of it, I would assume it would still be allowable. But yeah, to be fair, I haven't really looked at the later period. And by that time, the insanity defense was almost never used because that had really fallen out of favor quite a bit. So.
George, to go to your presentation, and this comes from Nell Urban Painter via Glenn Schaefer, and that talk a little bit more about the relationship between Prohibition and women's suffrage, which
Yeah.
you also
So, I mean,
thought that it's the woman's AN rather than EN, Christian Temperance Union. But anyway, Prohibition and suffrage, a number of the certainly the Reverend Sperling that you showed was discussed earlier in our program about women's suffrage. And so,
yeah, she was a big advocate of women's suffrage. That when the WCTU came out in favor of women's suffrage early in the 20th century, and I don't remember the exact year, but it was a huge boost to the suffrage movement in the United States because they were such a big organization. They had huge amounts of money. They had on-the-ground organization all over the place. So there was a strong association between suffrage and temperance. And that was also something that led to anti-suffrage in New Jersey. Now, that's something I pointed out in an earlier presentation I did on the anti-suffrage movement in New Jersey. When the state of New Jersey had a referendum in 1915 on whether or not to give women the vote, it was resoundingly defeated in New Jersey. And Newark had the biggest anti-suffrage vote of any place in New Jersey. And a big part of it was the liquor industry, because the liquor industry was very fearful that if women got the vote, they would bring in suffrage. And that wasn't a crazy fear. That wasn't an irrational fear. But I think that's part of the reason that the opposition to suffrage diminished after World War I, because at that point, Prohibition was already in. So, and Prohibition had been brought in by a male-controlled Congress. So you could no longer say, oh, let's not give women the vote because they'll bring in Prohibition. Well, Prohibition already happened. So that one of the main oppositions to women's suffrage was no longer there.
but the separation between the advocacy by white women and Black women was the same for on temperance as it was on suffrage?
I think, that's a good question. And, to be honest, I haven't looked that closely at how it might or may not have worked in temperance. Certainly in suffrage, you had a lot of segregation, but later by the 1910s, you had more cooperation. And certainly in New Jersey, you had Lillian Fikert, who actually went to Florence Randolph and asked her to join the executive board. And so you actually had greater cooperation between white and Black women in New Jersey over the issue of suffrage in the 1910s and beyond. Whether you had some of that with temperance, I'm just not as familiar with that. I suspect there were moments when you might have, but probably not that much. And because you had so many of these organizations that operated out of churches, and you would have you would have like conventions in towns that were segregated. So, Black women couldn't even come and stay in the hotels. So all kinds of practical, bars, as well as just, cultural prejudice that made it difficult for the groups to work together. But I don't want to go too far because there may have been more cooperation than I'm aware of.
And are you able to, any of you, to speak to how Newark compared to other parts of the country in terms of bootlegging volume or in enforcement?
Well, it sounds like from the statistics Laura gave that Newark was at the top of the list.
I mean, what are the sources? You said 40 to 70%?
Yeah, the FBI itself says it's at least 40%. And, in the kind of newspaper memoirs, like quotes from like the, the gangsters, they're saying, anywhere between 60 to 70%. So even if you split the difference, half of illegal liquor is probably coming through Newark. So it is kind of strange. And that's kind of what attracted me to the topic to begin with, is how do we have this city that at least 50% of all illegal liquor is running primarily through Canada and Joe Reinfeld, but we don't know anything about it. And Longy is this, criminal, bigger than Al Capone in some ways. Well, nobody knows anything about him. I don't know if it's because it's New Jersey and because it, is in the shadow of New York, or they didn't get their crimes as visible in, the press. There's not as many murders. It's unclear as to why Newark doesn't get as much press as it should, and as much credit as it should for being such a wet. And our politicians did not, they're drinking out in the street. So it's not, no one's hiding it.
Well, Bob Burke is asking, were the Newark police involved in enforcement, or was it primarily the federal team?
It's primarily the federal team. Yeah, I mean, they're on the streets, but it's primarily the federal team, which is why Ira Reeves becomes such like a, focal point for law enforcement, because he's one of the more, visible faces. But the turnover rate is about every 9 months for a prohibition officer. So he was not the only one that had a short stint. It's a tough job. And
so Guy Sterling points out that the police commissioner then was Brennan, William Brennan's father. What was his role in all of this?
You don't see him mentioned very much in any of the works on him. I mean, he exists, but there's nothing like that calls directly to him. So I think it was a minimal police presence in, these kinds of raids. Most of the time you see the federal agents, which, they tried to kind of militarize, but they were kind of a ragtag group, that, were in a rotating door. So they weren't super effective, even if they wanted to be, which generally they weren't.
Michele, I want to bring into the conversation, and not just the chat, this question about whether women really were in more danger from their drunk husbands because they had less rights, or was it sensationalized?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was sensationalized because, nobody really talked about this before. It was obviously women were in a much more precarious position. It was very difficult to get divorced. Women often didn't have rights to, even money that they earned when they were married. And, the temperance movement highlighted this, and the way that they highlighted this lack of rights for women was by talking about husbands who didn't fulfill, that duty to, provide for the family. So it was especially useful to kind of highlight the man who would take his wife's, earnings and go spend it, or where the children weren't provided for. But they also very much talked about women, getting, beaten by their husbands. And the interesting thing about that is the only other place you heard that sort of narrative was the Washingtonians, who used that as almost a way to show the depths to which they had sunk, but were now sort of looking, for forgiveness. I mean, some of their stories are really horrific. If you, the point is they're redeemed, but if you pay attention to what they did to their wives and children, and now expect to be redeemed for that, at first they were the only ones really talking about the, the physical effects on women and children. The temperance movement, though, then starts highlighting this from the perspective of women. But, that narrative of the Washingtonians does almost provide a way for men to be like, to offer an explanation. I was so drunk, I never would have, struck my wife, who I love, more than anything else. And, a lot of men went into court with that. The demon rum made me do such a thing, looking to get sympathy. And Martin was, quite good at that. Even though if you look, there's really this history. It wasn't this one occasion where he was drunk. There was a history of him abusing his wife.
Rick Bolshock has asked if any of you want to talk about the difficulty of enforcing prohibition and the difficulty now of enforcing the 21 drinking age, or probably the difficulty of enforcing the marijuana laws and other things until recently.
I think those are good analogies.
Good analogies.
I don't have anything profound to say about it.
I was 20 when New Jersey raised it back to 21. I can point that out.
I'm old enough that when I was in college in Texas, the drinking age was 18.
Yeah,
So.
I was glad it was 18.
Yeah, me too.
Gail Momgreen has pointed out that apparently quite a lot of alcohol was produced in Newark during Prohibition years, as opposed to imported drink. That large chemical factories were turned into stills. Do you know anything about that, or any idea of the?
Yeah, there was quite a lot of wildcat breweries. So a bunch of, different, you would go into kind of a farmhouse and there would be a giant vat, and they would be brewing all kinds of alcohol. They were also using industrial alcohol and wood alcohol, which led to a lot of poisonings and deaths. But you would see that, Reeves and others would talk about, they would brew this kind of fake whiskey in these wildcat breweries, and then, make the counterfeit labels, and then put them on and then sell it as real liquor. And it would be a real, but you would find like, rat feces floating in it, or sometimes dead rats floating in the wildcat breweries. Drinking in Prohibition, it was a risk for many reasons, and one was that you have no idea what was in those bottles or where it came from.
And what's the story behind that photograph you showed of changing the signs from denatured alcohol or to denatured alcohol?
Yeah, because people were making their own alcohol and then would be advertising it as the kind of legal alcohol that you would need for like industrial equipment. So he would go around to try to say you need to be, explicit in the type of alcohol you were selling. But generally they were selling it from, every which way, making it in all kinds of different places. It was real adventurous.
Well, good. If you, a final comment from each of you, and then we'll wrap it up. If you would like a final comment.
No, I don't think I need a final comment. I think it was these are great presentations and good questions. So yeah.
And it sure makes me hope for when we can all gather again in person and somehow have live streaming so that people can join from a distance, but we can also engage with each other in person. We're hoping that we
have a drink together.
We have a series of 6 programs planned. We'll get word out to everybody on the Newark History Society list, 3 of which we hope to do in cooperation with NJPAC. But this is Laura and Michele and George. This is really a great way to close out a difficult year, but where we continue to discuss Newark and its always fascinating history. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it back to Najia now.
Hi, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Michele and Laura and George. This was another amazing panel. I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended tonight. You guys were so engaged and great questions. So I'm just so grateful for Tim and Newark History Society and our continued partnership. And so we are looking forward to the future and to a new season to continue to do this. It's been a phenomenal year. We're just so grateful to be a part of the Newark History Society a series where we get to be well informed of what was happening here in the city, because we know we need to know our history if we need to know where we're going, right? So again, thank you, Tim and panelists. I also want to say again, thank you to ADP, who is our official sponsor for community engagement here at NJPAC. Please look out on our website, njpac.org, for all the latest happenings. I want to let you guys know to please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. You'll see some great reopening campaign videos that we think will make brighten your spirits. We are having talks of reopening, so we encourage you to go there and watch the videos, enjoy them, and share them. And so again, we say thank you for tonight, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.
Thanks.
Good night.
Night.